kind of a God would ask a person to sacrifice their child? That's it. I don't even know where to go from there. That's pretty much the only question we should be asking after reading this text. 21st century prophet, theologian, and author Rachel Held Evans, may she rest in peace, once said, "I have come to regard with some suspicion those who claim that the Bible never troubles them. I can only assume this means that they haven't actually read it." That's how I feel about this story. Troubled, vexed, angry, and I'm not alone. Countless theologians and scholars, including Martin Luther, who is with us in worship today, and John Calvin, who is oddly absent, actually, have ranked it top among the Bible's texts of terror, a name later coined by biblical scholar and author Phyllis Tribble. Stories from our Holy Scripture which speak of things like slavery, genocide, assassination, beheading, cannibalism, rape, and other heinous acts. For the record, I can't tell if I'm reading a list of brutally primitive and archaic acts from the Bible or the headlines for the evening news, but I digress. These texts of terror very rarely see the light of day in a Sunday morning worship service, and they certainly don't grace too many church school lessons. I think as a collective, we in the church just try to gloss over them, really, until we find something a bit nicer to read. And if we have to read them, we tend to hyper-focus on what we feel is the moral lesson at the end. Because really, who wants to even imagine the kind of God who would ask a person to sacrifice their child? Well, to even begin to unpack that question, we actually need to understand a bit more about the history of religion. And I actually primed you for this last Sunday when I talked about how the second creation narrative, which is listed as the first one in the Bible from Genesis 1, was an attempt by ancient Israelites to pit their understanding, their theology of the divine, against the maelstrom of myths and beliefs swirling around them at the time. Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and other world religions had long-standing ideas about how creation came to be, the function of the various gods and goddesses, and humanity's relationship to them. For the most part, humanity was an afterthought to the pantheons of gods, little more than cockroaches, at best mindless slave labor and playthings. So for ancient Israelites to come forward with a narrative of a God who created everything out of love and for love, and who designed human beings in God's own image, just a little lower than the angels, to be co-creators and stewards of the world, well, this was wildly countercultural. And it contradicted so much of how people understood divine beings and their relationship to them. Let me explain just a little bit more. Early human beings figured out that species survival was based on external factors, like food and water. This is not rocket science. Like food and water. Food required water and also sun in proper proportion. Too much or not enough of either would have detrimental effects on food source and subsequently human chance of survival. But here's the rub. Humans don't control those factors. Factors like the sun, the weather, and the seasons. Therefore, they concluded, something unseen must control them, something powerful, something like a god or a deity of some kind. Therefore, to improve one's own chance of survival, it would be ideal to garner the favor of that unseen force. So when crops won't grow, or you can't get pregnant, or your livestock falls ill, you do whatever you can to appease the gods of these unseen forces. The gods of sun and water, of weather and fertility and health, just to name a few. Perhaps you take a portion of your harvest and you offer it on an altar as a sign of gratitude. But then the next year it just doesn't seem to be working. Your crop's not doing as well. Perhaps the offering wasn't enough, and perhaps the gods want more. So you offer more, and then more. You try to outshine your neighbors in your devotion. You lose sleep, you grow anxious, then your crop fails. Perhaps the gods are upset with you. Perhaps they're punishing you or testing you. Worse yet, maybe they're just toying with you for fun. Go reread the book of Job. The point was, you were never really sure of where you stood with the gods. You couldn't trust them to be consistent, for their requests to be consistent. They were so easily angered. They were demanding and quick to punish puny humans. And it seemed that regardless if things went well or not, the human response to this was always more, never less. More devotion, more offering, more sacrifice, more worship. And so maybe at first you offered part of your crop, but then you upped the ante the next year. You offered up a goat, and then maybe a lamb, or even a cow. Maybe eventually you were sacrificing several cows. You were just always afraid, always anxious, striving to grasp at the good graces of fickle gods, escalating your sacrifice of gratitude and desperation year after year. So tell me, what would be the most valuable thing you could offer to the gods to prove to them how serious you were in earning their favor? Your child, of course. Child sacrifice is an unspoken reality in the background of much of the Old Testament, because it was a practice regularly implemented, particularly by the Canaanites, with whom the Israelites had this long-standing love-hate relationship. The Canaanites worshipped Molech, a god who was appeased by the sacrifice of children. And the practice was rampant enough that in Leviticus chapter 18, God had to spell it out that the Israelites were forbidden from giving their children in devotion by fire to Molech, and that doing so would profane the name of God. Listen, you don't make a rule like that out of the blue. You make it a rule when it's evident that there is an existing problem. So with that in hand, what do we do with Abraham and his son Isaac? Well, the story goes that Abram and Sarai were well on in years. She was in her 80s or 90s, depending who you read. She still hadn't produced an heir. So Sarah gave Abraham her handmaid, Hagar, and by her, Abraham received a son, Ishmael. Yeah, if you weren't aware, Isaac had an older half-brother. This was all well and good, except that God had insisted that Abraham would have a son by Sarah, and that it would be through that child that God would perpetuate their original covenant agreement. So even when Abram and Sarai tried to take matters into their own hands, wouldn't know anything about that, would we? God said, "Thank you, but I've got this. It's going to be through Isaac." And finally, Sarah does bear a son. 10 chapters and countless years after the original covenant, Sarah finally conceives and delivers Isaac, whose name means laughter. What a miracle. Out of the death of a barren womb, beyond what could be possible by human effort alone, God brought forth life. the God who promises, the God who provides. And it all seems pretty swell until the next chapter. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. And here's the rub, because take a look at that text again. Did you notice anything strange? Abraham, the man who argued with God against destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, the man who lied about Sarah being his wife to save his own skin with Pharaoh twice, this man made no protest when this command was made of him. None. Not a word. At the very least, we can extrapolate that the request was not shocking to him, because this is how the world worked, right? The gods always demanded that which was most valuable to you. And if you didn't ante up, you paid the price. So if we were going to secure the future, how else would we do it? So Abraham gets right to it. He doesn't even ask God for instructions. He knows what to do. And he gets down to it. For 3 days, Abraham, Isaac, and their servants traveled towards their destination. I imagine Abraham trying his best to memorize everything about his boy, the sound of his voice, the color of his eyes, the sound of his laughter. For 3 long days, his boy is as good as dead. When they reach the foot of the mountain, Abraham turns to his servants and says to them, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there, we will worship, and then we will come back to you." We. Shouldn't the subject change from plural to singular? If Abraham's plan is to go offer his son as a burnt offering, it would only be one of them returning from the mountain. Alarm bells ought to be going off at this point. Something else is happening here. So up they go, and as they hike, Isaac is running through the checklist. He must be type A. Okay, we have all the supplies, Dad. Wood, check. Fire, check. Lamb. Dad, where's the lamb? I can only imagine at some point Isaac knew something was off. Kids pick it up, no matter how much adults attempt to obscure it. He wants to believe his gut is wrong. He wants his father to reassure him that there's no need to imagine the worst. But his father, wearing a face of stone perhaps to hide a heart in tatters, mutters simply, "God will provide." So they keep walking towards their destination with nothing but wood, fire, a knife, and hope. It's just awful. Awful. I refuse to sugarcoat it for you. Rob Bell, author and teacher of our time, tells a story of a well-known preacher telling him that when his son was a teenager, this man took his son up on a hill and read to him the story of Abraham and the binding of Isaac, and then the preacher told his son that he would always love God more than him. Rob says, "He told me this story like it was an admirable thing he did to teach his son about devotion to God, and all I wanted to do was throw up." And while this has been such a pervasive understanding of Genesis 22 and the binding of Isaac for so long, I actually refuse to believe anymore that that is the angle here. Why? Because if you pay attention, you can see that Abraham tipped his hand when he was talking to the servants. Or, let me put it another way, I think that the author of Genesis broke the fourth wall. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, son. He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." And the two of them walked on together. The author was in on it. Abraham was in on it. Everyone thinks they know how this story is going to play out, but they're in for a surprise if they haven't been paying attention to this God. So Abraham goes through the motions, yes, I imagine, with shaking hands, binding his promised child on the altar, fire at the ready, knife raised, but then an angel of the Lord shouts out his name, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replies, as is his custom. "Do not lay your hand on the boy. I know your devotion, and you know mine. I shall provide the sacrifice." Because what kind of a God would ask a person to sacrifice their child? Not this God. No, this God draws the line at human sacrifice. The other so-called gods and goddesses may demand your firstborn, but not this God. This is the God who provides. The question is, do you trust this God? So why all the drama of Genesis 22? Why the charade? Go back to the basis of early religion. Fickle gods are never satisfied. They want more from us, more devotion, more gratitude, more subservience, more sacrifice. The first hearers of this story would have been shocked, not by the command of Abraham to sacrifice his son. Frankly, that part would have been expected. It would have been familiar and commonplace. What shocked the first hearers is when God stops the sacrifice, stops Abraham's hand. The gods don't do that. And then to ramp up the shock value, this God not only stops the human sacrifice, this God provides the sacrifice. This God does the giving. This was an utterly new concept. And then finally, to push this whole story right over the edge, after God stops the sacrifice and after God provides the lamb, God then doubles down on the promise of blessing. "I will indeed bless you, Abraham, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth," all the nations, all of them, "gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice." So not just you, Abraham, but all people everywhere for all time. I think we still come to the same conclusion, that Abraham is to be praised for his trust, his faith, his belief. But I think we get it wrong when we think it's because he was willing to sacrifice his son. Let me say that again. We get it wrong when we think that his gift of faith was in being willing to sacrifice his son. No, everyone was already on board with child sacrifice. It was sickeningly common in that day. What we need to see and celebrate is Abraham's faith in the God who can be trusted to provide. No gruesome sacrifice, no anxiety about where we stand, no competition with the neighbors to see who is more devoted than whom. Just belief and faith in a God who is trustworthy, who is faithful, and who is true. And the clue, the broken fourth wall, is back at the words that Abraham said to his servants. "We're going up the mountain to worship, and we will be right back." Abraham knew all along that this is the God who provides. He was committed to the God who can be trusted. Are we? I wonder how we continue to seek to appease the fickle gods of our time today. I wonder how we resist this cycle of anxiety by showing our hand that God can be trusted. God can be trusted. We can trust the God who provides. To God be all the glory. Amen.